Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon if you're joining us from the UK or Europe, and a warm welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Dalibor Rohac, or Rohac if you've given up on Central European accents, and I'm a resident scholar here at the EI, where I work on all things Europe, the EU, post-communist transitions, democratic backsliding in Central Europe, as well as transatlantic relations. And I'm delighted to welcome Syed Kamall, Lord Kamall, to AEI for what I hope to be a wide-ranging conversation about issues that are on the mind of every UK watcher these days. Syed was trained as an economist. He served as the leader of Conservatives in European Parliament. He was the co-chair of European Conservatives and Reformists, which is a family of European right-of-center conservative political parties. He's currently the research director at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, a venerable free market think tank founded by Arthur Seldon and Ralph Harris in 1955 under the auspices, intellectual auspices of Friedrich von Hayek. Back then, he's also a professor of economics, I believe, at St. Mary's University in Twickenham in southwest London. And most recently, he's been elevated to the House of Lords as Lord Kamall of Edmonton. It will disappoint our Canadian viewers that the Edmonton in question is in North London, not in Alberta, and actually used to shop at the IKEA there many years ago and carry heavy items with me on the tube on the way back. Syed, Lord Kamall, it's a pleasure to have you with us at the EI, although remotely. I should say that this is a public event live streamed on AEI's website, on YouTube. Therefore, everything you say is for public consumption, is on the record. I hope you won't pull any punches, though. And I should also tell our viewers that they can ask questions either by emailing my colleague Lance Kokonos, whose email you'll find at the event page, or on Twitter using the hashtag AEI Global Britain. And I would like to kick off this conversation by saying that although we, for many years, I think, agreed on many topics, one point at which we did part ways was in 2016 over the issue of Brexit, over this question of whether the UK would be better off outside of the EU or not. You were very much in favor of leaving. I, although as a non-Brit, did not think it was in the UK's best interest. It was certainly, in my opinion, not in Europe's best interest. I think I'm still, pretty much where I was on substantively in 2016. But I think it's fair to say that neither of us could predict that the first material consequence of Brexit would be this stunning divergence between the UK and the EU on the vaccine rollout. But last year, all the cognoscenti were unanimous that the UK was doing this extraordinary act of self-harm by not participating in the EU's common procurement scheme for the vaccine. And here we are. I checked the numbers yesterday. 47.6% of all Britons have received at least one dose of the vaccine, and less than 13% of EU nationals have. I presume you've been vaccinated already. I've been vaccinated here in DC. But what do you make of this unexpected, unpredictable upside of Brexit? What went wrong in Europe? What went right in the UK?
Well, Dalibor, first of all, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank your viewers and listeners for tuning in and giving up their time to listen to us today. It's interesting when you look at it from a sort of Brexit perspective, because some people say, oh, having left the EU and gone on our own, it shows that that was the right, decision. And when people say, is this an unexpected upside of Brexit? The answer really is it's more nuanced. It's yes and no. Had we been in the EU still, we probably still could have gone unilateral. I mean, in fact, one EU country, Hungary, got so fed up with the EU's incompetence that they've started ordering their vaccine directly from Russia and China. Germany now, some people in Germany, in the German politics, are now talking of doing so because they're so fed up of how the EU has handled this. But I think if we had been in the EU and tried to go unilateral, there would have been so much pressure within the UK from the sort of the pro-European elite, as it were, that they would have said, no, you've got to be good Europeans. So even though in theory we could have done this and gone unilateral within the EU, I think having left the EU and having not signed up to the EU's vaccine scheme, which many people in the UK wanted us to do, I think I think now we're looking good. But I think the question is, was that by design or was that by accident? And I've been running a number of webinars at the IEA over the last year, talking to various people about different aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of our authors, Professor Mark Pennington, wrote this, which I hope you'll bear with me, I thought was very interesting. He said, first of all, socio-economic systems should be understood as complex phenomena that can't be controlled or managed through central planning. You should look at pandemics also as complex systems that interact in often unpredictable ways, and then recognize that the complexity of the policy challenge will mean that successful responses may owe as much to accident as design. So at the beginning, the UK was seen to make many mistakes. But the good thing about the UK is that we learnt from our mistakes, and that process of discovery we learnt from. And I think this is where the EU still struggles. All countries, many countries made mistakes. The UK and EU countries individually and collectively made mistakes, but we seem to have learnt from it quicker. Was that by accident or was it by design? I think it's still too early to say. And the other thing about this is, don't forget, a few months ago, people were saying how marvelous Germany was how they were dealing with it, and how bad the UK was. That's all changed. Now the UK is seen as being brilliant, and the other countries very bad. But that could change again. We're suddenly by no means through all this. As well as that, in the UK, it's all very well us being vaccinated, but we don't take any pride in the EU messing up, because don't forget, we still want to travel to EU countries and visit friends and neighbours, and we still want to trade with them. So, and we want to travel. So it's in our interest that once we're vaccinated, to help as many other countries as possible to get their vaccine schemes in order.
Well, I very much agree with this sort of point about the complexity and sort of unpredictable nature of social life. And I suppose politics, which you were part of for many years, is one example of such sort of non-linear and oftentimes unpredictable systems. I mean, one of the things that worried me about Brexit and the sort of developments in the UK after the referendum was that the decision to leave the EU involved trade-offs that not all Brexiteers were quite willing to face. And to simplify, maybe very crudely, in order to retake control, so to speak, there are economic costs and disruptions with regard to regulatory barriers to trade with the EU, for example, and that was never really sort of articulated before the referendum, and those trade-offs became apparent in many ways afterwards, and that I think partly explains the difficult situation former Prime Minister Theresa May was in when she was trying to sort of sell sort of compromise package that neither satisfied her own backbenchers and neither really satisfied so the Remain side or Brussels, and it sort of looked impossible for a while that the circle could be squared, and then your current Prime Minister came along, made tweaks that are not overwhelmingly sort of substantively significant to the agreement, and somehow he managed to deliver. And I still think that there'll be costs and disruptions associated with retaking control, and maybe some of those are not quite as visible now that on both sides of the English Channel countries are dealing with the pandemic. But what is striking is that it has been done, right? Brexit has been delivered, and one of the sort of side effects of that is that it seems to have successfully tamed political populism in the UK in a way populism has not been tamed on the other side of the English Channel. Right now, Marine Le Pen has a decent chance of France's presidency, and although I think the sort of Brexit movement was in many ways a populist one, it's very hard to sort of call either party in the UK right now populist. Those sort of voices that try to divide the country into a self-serving elite and a sort of pure-hearted people that's been left behind, like those voices are, I think, far less prominent than they were in 2016. Is that impression correct, that sort of the UK has essentially neutralized its populist instincts by delivering what populists were asking for?
Well, it depends. I mean, how you define populism. It's interesting. I've also hosted some webinars where we've discussed populism, and there are different strands to populism. Some of them are nationalist, some of them are not, actually quite different. And of course, people who were against Brexit were, did describe Brexit as populism. But what they didn't understand was both sides of the referendum debate were coalitions of different strands. So, for example, if you look at the pro-EU strand, or the pro-EU Remain campaign, it was based on those who genuinely did want Britain to be part of a political integrated project, a United States of Europe, a Federal Republic of Europe. They're all the way through to people who were probably a little bit skeptical, but were worried about the short-term consequences of leaving. And Project Fair, which was really the main strand of the Remain campaign, did scare people in that way. What let the Remain side down, I think, was that there was no positive vision about what staying in the EU meant. It was all about how terrible it would be if you left. Now, the Leave side was a different coalition, and sometimes quite contradictory. You had your globalist libertarians who saw the EU as too small and protectionist. I mean, and you yourself described how the classical liberal movement was split. Some were worried that the UK would become more protectionist. Others said, no, this is a great opportunity for us to leave a protectionist bloc. You also had people who were talking about sovereignty and different definitions of that on the Leave side. And you also had people who were worried about immigration. And there were three strands to that. There were some people on the Leave side who were racist and didn't want any immigration, but they were the minority. The other two groups were people who said, we just have no control over immigration. With the EU, anyone with an EU passport can come in, and that's that, no real control. And then there were other guys on immigration who said, it's unfair. Why do we give priority to Europeans, most of whom happen to be white, over people without EU passports, most of whom happen to be black or Asian or have dark skin? It's a racist immigration policy. And interestingly enough, there were racists on the Remain side who voted Remain because they said, we want the right sort of immigration. And what they meant was the white sort of immigration. There was a racist strand on both sides of that. So within that, there would have been elements on both sides of populism. But I think to your main question, if you look at Euroscepticism, and you describe it as populism, but let's focus on Euroscepticism. In the UK, you saw elements of Euroscepticism in the mainstream parties. UKIP, okay, was a non-mainstream party, but you couldn't call it extreme. It may have had some odd figures, but it wasn't an extreme party. The Conservatives had Eurosceptics, there were Labour Eurosceptics, and even Lib Dem Eurosceptics. There was a Liberal Leave campaign at the time. On the continent, what's really interesting is that if you are Eurosceptic, none of the mainstream parties really have that as part of their offering. And therefore, you're either forced to vote for an extreme party, or you hold your nose and vote for a mainstream party, or you stay at home. I spoke to many people in many other EU countries who told me they were Eurosceptic, but there was no mainstream party that represented their view. And I think that's the lesson for those parties in other countries. Do they want to get that vote? Can they adopt Euroscepticism without it being extreme?
So when I was using the term populism, of course, I was using it in the sort of thin technical sense to describe political platforms and movements and groups that essentially build their rhetoric and operate on the basis of this assumption that there is a self-serving elite and people that's been sort of left behind, and try to sort of use the grievances that have been perhaps overlooked by elites in the past. And it looks like, that's been a sort of defining feature of sort of Western politics for close to a decade now. There were people who were trying to make this equivalence between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. But I think that sort of equivalence right now falls flat, right? Like you have what look like, when I look at the UK from the outside, it looks like there's a very sort of normal conservative government with a sort of very normal center-left opposition party. It looks like a far more predictable and sort of normal political landscape than many of the landscapes in other European countries or indeed in the UK. One feature maybe that has sort of shifted within the Conservative Party relative to where it was 10 years ago is one that might be of concern, I suppose, to people at IEA, namely that the party seems to have sort of moved to the left on some aspects of economic policy. And I remember when I started working in the think tank industry in London 10 years ago, this emphasis on deficits and getting budget under control was far stronger than under Prime Minister Johnson. Is this the correct impression? I mean, and I know much of this is driven by the pandemic, the need to provide assistance to businesses in need and keep them afloat during these difficult times. But it looks like these sort of concerns over debt and deficit and sustainability of public finances, at the very least, have essentially been swept to the side. And I haven't really seen sort of big efforts at like liberalizing the economy and doing something with like land use regulations, for example, which are a big hurdle to economic growth in the UK. Is this basically the right impression?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that we are living in extraordinary times, and even classical liberals have said, you read various classical liberal commentators in difficult times, in times of war or times like this, people put more trust in government. Maybe those who are minimal statists will say this is when you need a state as a safety net. Was the alternative just letting the business go to the wall and all these people then claim an unemployment benefit? Maybe it's better in the overall system to give them some support so they can come out the other end. And it's a real debate that we've had, and we have been concerned. I have been concerned about maybe once we're out of this crisis, will the Tory party still have those policies, or will they roll back and go for liberalisation? The other challenge for the Conservative Party is that our demographics of voters have changed. Under David Cameron, we were very much the sort of liberal Conservatives in metropolitan areas, London and the South East. And what's happened now is that we've appealed to working class former Labour voters in the Midlands and the North. And the challenge for the new MPs in those areas, and what they tell me, is that are we just going to try and outspend Labour just by chucking lots of taxpayers' money at these areas in the hope of these people will vote Conservative again? Or are there free market or market-oriented solutions, such as devolution as part of the 11 Up agenda? And so far, we've been looking at ideas of enterprise zones, free ports, some market-oriented thoughts. But it does concern us. And there is a joke amongst sort of free market and classical liberal Conservatives that some local Conservative councillors just want to run socialism better than the socialists. I just hope that's not true for this Conservative government.
Good. I mean, it looks like there might be some parallels between the developments you described and what's been happening on this side of the Atlantic with the GOP, I mean, which is very much in a state of flux right now. But I think it's fair to say that more and more people in Congress have sort of flirted with these sort of ideas that maybe free markets are outdated and we should try something else, and then there is almost like an unholy alliance over things like tech emerging between some of the populist voices in the GOP, like Josh Hawley, and people on the political left, like Elizabeth Warren. So, and I think it's sort of following the same trajectory in terms of sort of voters shifting from sort of formerly working class backgrounds that used to be at the backbone of the Democratic Party. So, so if this is a structural shift, then I think it sort of leaves free marketeers, classical liberals in a fairly difficult position going forward. And I suppose our mutual friend Steve Davis would argue that this is a permanent shift, that this is what we are sort of stuck with for the foreseeable future, and the question is like in which party sort of will be a sort of minority faction, but the sort of idea of the 1980s 1990s coming back is probably out of reach.
I mean, Steve Davis does believe that there is a major realignment in politics going on at the moment. And I think people quite often try and compare the British Conservatives with the Trump Republicans, if you like. I think the one common factor I do see, and some people might well say this is populism, is the way that the Conservative Party at the last election, by winning those seats that were neglected former Labour voter, working class voters, voted Conservative, we saw Trump do that, didn't we? Trump went into sort of old mining areas and said, you people have been left behind by the elite in Washington. I'm going to look out for you. And it was interesting that Joe Biden could get some of that support back, whereas Hillary clearly couldn't. Hillary was seen more as an elitist figure, if you like, and less so bizarrely Joe Biden, even though he had been in Washington for many years. But yes, of course, I do worry, and I think there is a challenge here. Political parties have always been coalitions as well. When I give advice to young people who want to go into politics, I give them two pieces of advice. One is just personal: make sure that you have a partner that understands what politics involves, because you make incredible sacrifices. And I've seen too many friends' relationships break up over politics because they haven't been honest about it. And the second bit of advice I give is that join the party that you agree with the most or disagree with the least. And if you're a classical liberal in the UK, you've got two choices. You've got the Conservative Party, and there are a number of strains of conservatism that you probably would disagree with, more interventionist, more paternal conservatism, for example. But also you've got the Lib Dems, and the Lib Dems sadly have become more social democratic. I still have some friends who are Lib Dem classical liberals, but they are just as frustrated. And I've in fact had a conversation. I remember talking to the leader of the Lib Dem party, who happens to be my local member of parliament. And I said to him, you've got a real opportunity to capture some of those liberals who feel homeless at the moment. But the problem with you is that you're too obsessed with Europe. And he said to me, and this was just before the general election in 2019. So he said to me, I will fight Brexit with every bone in my body. And I found that amongst some European liberal movements. When I used to talk to my colleagues in the European Parliament when I was an MEP, some of them would say to me, I'm a liberal, but I'm also pro-European. If you give me a choice, and I mean liberal from a classical liberal perspective, not the modern liberal perspective, what they said to me, you give me a choice between my liberalism and my Euro fanaticism, I'll choose Europe. And I think that's a pity, really. Because there are classical liberals who might well feel homeless, and I am a classical liberal who's a conservative, and I try and fight that cause of small state, more responsibility, but also remembering that we have to help those less fortunate than ourselves, and also what's the role of the state as a safety net, but also there are non-state solutions to tackling poverty.
Well, so I'm trying to actually respond to that sort of dilemma that your friend has between Europe and classical liberalism, but trying to find a sort of richer way of talking about European integration than just this, which really strikes me as a false choice between ever closer union and letting the whole project unravel. I think there are various ways in which European countries can cooperate, even under sort of EU's auspices, that would be more effective than the status quo, or than indeed the sort of somewhat utopian efforts at creating sort of forced artificial political unity on the continent. That will be subject of my next book. So sorry for plugging that in. We have a question for one of our viewers on Brexit and trade liberalization. Obviously, this was one of the selling points for classical liberals and free marketeers, that the UK will become a free trading nation again, able to strike new deals with countries around the world. Perhaps from a US perspective, the most important thing is, what do you think the prospects for a US-UK trade agreement are under the current administration?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of keenness on both sides of the Atlantic from free traders, and I think we could probably strike a deal which didn't have to necessarily follow all the ways of the old one. One of the problems with other trade agreements usually is that you focus so much on agriculture, particularly WTO, before you talk about where the real value is, which is services and then industrial goods. What tends to happen, you have to unlock agriculture, then you can talk about industrial goods and goods, and then you can talk about services. And I think we could have just had an honest conversation. What is feasible under a free trade agreement and what is not. And I think we always have to be quite clear about this as free traders. No, many of these things called free trade agreements aren't truly free trade agreements. Economists would call them preferential trade agreements. What they are, a real trade agreement would just be a simple piece of paper that says, you open up your markets, I'll open up mine. But we don't do that. We have certain sectors that we protect, that we keep closed, and we have our domestic lobbies that influence us. But to answer the question on the deal, I think Biden, the impression I get from Biden is that he is more pro-EU. Clearly he's one of those Americans who regrets the fact that the UK left the EU. But I think he's going to find it quite difficult. He would probably prefer to do a US-EU deal, but he would find some of the same problems that Obama faced when he tried to negotiate TTIP on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to be that easy. Also, Biden has in the past demonstrated his support for Irish nationalism. And Irish nationalism quite often is quite anti-British. Now, I'm not saying Biden is anti-British, but I think he would prefer to do a deal with the EU before the UK. I think certainly if we had not left the EU with a deal, it would not be on the table. But I'm not seeing much evidence. I'd be much more interested in your views of the willingness to sign any trade deals. People thought, elect Biden, he would sort out the WTO after Trump had blocked the appointment of the Director General and the appellate body. He'd probably reignite TTIP. He'll probably re-enter CPTPP and probably try and sign trade agreements. But I'm not seeing any evidence of that so far. But maybe it's too early. I don't know. What do you think? Sorry, I know you're supposed to be asking me questions.
Well, in the campaign, I think he was very cautious, and the sort of official platform was very cautious about trade agreements. He said that there would have to be stakeholders at the table, which means labor unions, sort of environmental groups. There were no commitments, I think, to sort of specific trade agreements with particular countries around the world. And yeah, I mean, TTIP wasn't. Was always going to be a difficult sell on both sides of the Atlantic, including, by the way, in the UK. I mean, you had the sort of massive resistance in places like Germany, but it was also in the UK where people were freaking out about the NHS's impending privatization and then hormone-laden beef and so forth. So I have to say I'm fairly skeptical. Maybe this sort of era of sort of ambitious sort of regional trade agreements is for some time over, and I think that again leaves us in a difficult spot, given that the WTO system isn't in a great shape either. And there is actually the piece for the Spectator in London a few weeks ago on how there is a degree of continuity in a way between Trump and Biden in their skepticism towards trade. The fact that, as you said, the appellate body still is sort of that the appointments are being blocked, and actually there's a segue into what I was going to ask you next, which is that the big part of the American conversation has to do with China, and what really is a bipartisan concern about the role China has been playing internationally, the way it's been abusing the international trading system, and I think that sort of creates a challenge for the Brexit project in a way. Like if there is an effort at, say, partial decoupling by America, if there is this broader waking up to the Chinese challenge in the West, like how do you integrate that with this idea of global Britain, which almost sounds like it needs this benign global trading environment to succeed. Like you don't want to end up in the middle of sort of warring trade blocks.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, I mean, one thing you said at the beginning is that I do teach in universities one day a week. I'm a professor of politics and international relations, and I teach politics, international politics and these issues. And in fact, Steve Davies, who you mentioned earlier, and I wrote a paper during COVID about the challenge of dealing with China after COVID. And the interesting thing, I think, going back to what we just talked about Biden, was that Biden did probably want to be quite aligned with the EU when he first came in. But what's interesting on China, he seems to have aligned, the UK and the USA seem to have aligned pretty closely, becoming increasingly skeptical about China. And the challenge here is, and we faced this when the UK was part of the EU vis-a-vis Russia, it was all very well certain countries being tough on Russia. but we always knew that the French and the Germans would go and sign deals with them anyway, because of their, I remember a French politician saying to me, you will not find a French political party that's skeptical of Russia, or will challenge Russia. And the Germans, if you look at how much of their energy comes from that part of the world, and there's some of the historic links, so Angela Merkel and Putin have a good relationship, for example. Those are real challenges for everyone else trying to challenge Russia. And likewise with China, I think Biden was quite disappointed by the EU-China investment deal that they've signed it seemed to be at the wrong time, when all the eyes of the world were on China, not only over their mishandling of COVID and not reporting it at the beginning, but also the other issues, the issues with their border with India, their aggression in their neighborhood, the treatment of the Uyghurs, the Muslim population in China, and all these things coming together meant that both America and the US realized now it's time that sort of that sort of liberalism of IR theory of open cooperation had its limits, and China wasn't going to necessarily change. Now, Steve and I wrote this paper, and we get challenged by it. Some people think we're too pro-Chinese or whatever. What we've said is that do not see the threat from China, if you like, if it is a threat, as a new Cold War. China hasn't replaced the Soviet Union as the baddies. It's not a simple substitution. What China has, and the Chinese Communist Party has, is a China first strategy. And what that means is that they want access to markets, they want access to raw materials, they want access to technology and know-how. That will still present challenges for us, as you see with the Belt and Road initiative, also some of their investments in various countries, which undermine conditionality of aid, for example. And in their neighborhood, there is a very long memory of their experiences with both the Japanese and the British. And they're determined in their neighborhood never to be dominated again. And that's why you see aggression in their neighborhood. If we understand that, then maybe how do we face that challenge? Those still present challenges for us. And one of the things that Steve and I believe, maybe we're being too idealistic about this, is let's not rely on government for links. Let's make sure there are more people-to-people links, more civil society links. And what may well happen by driving that through civil society and individual links, the Chinese government will have to adopt whatever changes come about. In the same way that when farmers started trying to sell their surpluses in China, Deng Xiaoping saw that and actually went along with it and started allowing Chinese farmers to sell their surpluses, which led to more market reforms.
I certainly agree that very often these lazy historical parallels being made between China and the Soviet Union. I suppose one of the differences that actually many of my AEI colleagues have been writing about is the fact that unlike in the USSR, that really saw itself as the country of the future, I think it is sort of looming on the Chinese leadership that China is not necessarily a rising power. It faces terrible demographic outlook for the future. I think the sort of low-hanging fruit of this sort of growth model that they have followed has largely exhausted itself. It's very hard in an unfree society to have an economy built on sort of innovation and free flow of ideas and competition of ideas. And what that means is that, and that actually creates challenges of its own, right? Like sort of a power that's no longer rising might become more aggressive to at least secure a place within the international system, and so I think our alliances might get tested sooner rather than later, in places like Taiwan, and I think that's not a happy prospect to have. But I think there is this broader question there, which is for classical liberals to think about how our commitment to economic openness can be reconciled with the existence of a sort of political and economic system that actually uses economic interdependence to pursue its political goals. And in the US, I have to say that there is now sort of an emerging cross-party consensus on the need to deploy industrial policy to protect certain sectors from sort of Chinese presence, to sort of build American alternatives to sort of Chinese dominated technologies. And I mean, I'm not quite sure like what where I sit on the sort of spectrum within these conversations, but it's all making me somewhat nervous. And I understand that there are complicated trade-offs involved. So I'd love to read your paper with Steve. But if you can give us maybe a 30-second summary of where you both sit on this.
Yeah, so as I said, don't compare it to the last Cold War, but do see it as there are two elements to the challenge. One is China not wanting to be dominate in its own territory again, memories of China, domination by the Japanese and the British. Secondly, it's a China first strategy. It's almost like we're in a sort of the Trump's baseball cap, and crossing out America and put China first. Access to markets, access to raw materials, access to technology, and know-how. And that's what drives everything. Interestingly enough, it's not like the USSR. It's not trying to export its ideology like the USSR did, but it might well end up as an exemplar country to say to developing countries there is another path from liberal democracy. That's what it's trying to do. I mean, not necessarily explicitly. What we do say is that you should limit trade in sensitive areas. And it's quite right what the UK started to do on some of its telecommunications equipment, for example. And I know the USA and Korea and one other country doesn't buy a Chinese telecoms equipment. We'll still buy stuff that's non-critical, but not things that are critical, and you can just read stuff off. And that's a challenge. Only the security experts can tell us whether that's workable or not. And then encouraging perhaps trade in other areas, but also being quite deliberate and focused on the criticisms. Don't criticize the Chinese. That's too lazy. Criticize the Chinese government or the Communist Party of China strategy. Otherwise, people will fall in behind and feel that they're all attacked. And also, have as many links as you can between Chinese civil society and individuals. Now, that's not simple because some academics are now starting to write about the Chinese government's influence in British academia and European academia. And I'm sure you'll say in European academia. But at the same time, we want our universities to be open to Chinese students so we can exchange ideas. And hopefully they can go back with some of our ideas and help reform in their own country. So there's no silver bullet. I may be naive. I may be wrong, but at the moment, I think we've got to get away from this Cold War mentality that we've got to treat China as the Soviet Union.
So this area of higher education is fascinating. I'm not sure if you saw the news yesterday that Fudan University is opening a campus in Hungary and providing it with funding, which I think will exceed the Hungarian government's funding to all universities combined. So it will be certainly a major player with outside funding. This comes, just 2 years after Viktor Orban's government chased away the Central European University founded by George Soros from Hungary. But I think the wider conversation in Europe, you described it as being fairly sort of naive about China, might be changing in the wake of these really ham-fisted sanctions that China imposed on some of your former colleagues from European Parliament, a bunch of European organizations. In some ways, Chinese are their own worst enemy when it comes to sort of diplomacy and outreach. You saw it last year with COVID and these like efforts to provide aid, which was not really aid, with PPE and so forth. So I think public opinion has shifted. It will be very hard to get in my opinion, to get the comprehensive agreement on investment through European Parliament at this point. And I think that's a major setback for China. But your sense is that the UK government is more or less getting this sort of balance right.
Yeah, I mean, we are edging towards a different policy. I mean, at one time we almost wanted to be when David Cameron was Prime Minister and George Osborne, we almost wanted to be the centre for China in Europe, and now we've rolled back from that. We've seen the way that the Chinese government has been acting. And there are still some concerns in the UK. People are concerned about, for example, investment from Chinese and Russians in the UK, for example. But I think there's more awareness of the issue now, particularly in the light of COVID and the Chinese government's lack of transparency over the outbreak of COVID. That then has focused attention on the Chinese government, and then people have started to remember all the other issues. Like, I mean, you've seen the Chinese army be quite aggressive on its border with India. Now, that is a legacy of the old British Empire, but still, for the first time, I think in 40 years, they actually killed some Indian soldiers. And India, which always saw itself as this non-aligned nation, is suddenly jumping. You saw they talked as part of the Quad with Biden. The UK's foreign policy is now going to be more oriented to the Asia-Pacific region as well. And so countries are starting to look at how you can counterbalance China. And one of those issues might well be the TPP or the CPTPP. And it might be a reason for the US to re-enter the CPTPP as a sort of counterbalance to China.
Let's shift gears just a little bit for a few minutes and talk about some of the most contentious issues that are out there right now. So both in the US and in the UK, we've seen a fair share of culture wars over questions like immigration, race, gender, and identity. And I think there is something of an emergent consensus on the political left, certainly in the United States, that the American society and perhaps most Western societies are in a way irredeemably permeated by racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. And I saw the headlines last week about the UK Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. It actually resonated quite strongly on this side of the Atlantic as well. Came under heavy criticisms, apparently mostly because its conclusion was that there has been a lot of progress that's been made. And so I wonder, like, where you stand on some of these issues, and what should the right response be? Because I think both you and I are cognizant of the fact that racism and prejudice and uneven playing field are a reality for people of color, minorities, women, etc., etc. But I think both you and I are quite firmly committed to individual equality before the law, and are fairly skeptical of sort of sweeping collective generalizations about groups of people. And furthermore, here you are, son of an immigrant bus driver, if I'm correct, a British Muslim, and a life peer.
Yeah, I mean, we do have some of the debates, and sometimes I see a lot of similarities, and sometimes I see quite some differences. But let's look at the report that we had in the UK that was released last week. And I'm still making my way through the report. And what strikes me about the report was how much evidence and data they had collected. I thought that was fascinating, that it wasn't just starting with assumptions. And even if there were some assumptions, they try to challenge those assumptions. But then I looked at the response to the report, and in some ways it was predictable. It fell along the traditional lines of disagreement. So the collectivist left, if you like, were very dismissive of the report. Unless you said that Britain is institutionally racist, then the report's not worth the paper it's written on. And interestingly enough, a lot of the Black authors came under quite a lot of abuse online for their role in that. Some of it quite racist from the left. And it's interesting because the left always ignore their very own racism. We saw this with under Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party. There was a lot of anti-Jewish feeling in the Labour movement, in the left-wing movement. And one of the things I found during my political career is that there are some white socialists who ain't nothing more than a black or brown conservative. They only like Black people if they're poor or they're victims or they vote for left-wing parties. And if you don't do that, then you don't fit their stereotype and they actually dislike you quite strongly. And I had that experience, particularly in the European Parliament. The last leader of the socialist group was a very unpleasant man who I knew was one of those white socialists who hated nothing more than a black or brown conservative. And also I remember when I talked about the lack of diversity in the EU, and I made some comment that if you want to see racial diversity in the EU, look at the faces of the cleaners as they leave the building in the mornings as the smug white officials turn up for work. and one of the social democratic commissioners of the EU just laughed at me. And the leader of the Liberal group said to me, that's just the way it is, you have to accept it. And the leader of the Greens said to me, they're women, that's the point, it's not their colour. And I just thought, that sort of, that sort of below the surface racism that was very evident right across the political spectrum in the European Parliament was there. But as I said, going back to the report, I think people fell along those same lines. So there are lots of people on the left, not all but that sort of new left authoritarians who believe that Britain's institutionally racist. And really interesting, one of the criticisms said the report spent a long time trying to define institutional racism and criticized it for that. But surely if you're going to tackle institutional racism, you're going to have to define it. And I've been trying to find definitions. I went back to Carmichael in the 60s when he coined the phrase. But then he said, because black babies were born into poverty, the US was institutionally racist. And that was the link. And so they didn't accept the fact that that there was a positive story to be told. When my father came to Britain in the 50s, and when he used to speak to me as a child, he said Britain was much better in the 70s and 80s than it was when he came in the 50s, when it came to race. I still face a lot of racism. I mean, I got chased by skinheads with knives. I got people jump on top of me and give me a good kick in. Fortunately, that doesn't happen as much now in the UK. And my children have faced a much better environment. And I think we have to recognise that we've come a long way in the UK. And I would say, having been in the EU and travelled to many EU countries and spoken to taxi drivers and others, that we are probably one of the best countries. Not a reason to be complacent, but I think we're a lot better than people make us out to be. And I just worry that I don't think we are ever going to satisfy that group of people who make money out of saying Britain is racist, that sort of race relations, diversity industry. If racism went away, and we're not saying that the report didn't say there was no racism. In fact, I think it was very good in the way it said, let's identify where there is racism and let's target that, rather than lazily saying that Britain is institutionally racist.
I think that's very wise. One thing that is probably different on this side of the Atlantic is that this conversation about race and wokeness, if you will, has become part of this sort of self-perpetuating cycle of sort of mutual delegitimization that's happening, from both sides of the political divide, where you see people who see each other more and more as sort of mortal enemies than as adversaries within a democratic political system. And I mean, yes, I think that does raise concerns. Fortunately, the situation doesn't seem to be quite as dire in the UK right now. One quick question, which is somewhat related, because obviously the British story of race relations, etc., has to do partly with the colonial heritage. Yeah. There is, I'm told, this is from one of our viewers actually, there is a meeting of Commonwealth heads of governments taking place in Rwanda shortly. So where do you see the UK's role within the Commonwealth, but specifically within sub-Saharan Africa in coming years evolve, as the UK outside of the EU can pursue its own foreign policy and trade outreach?
Yeah, I think the Commonwealth is hugely important. I mean, when I think about it, my parents came from a Commonwealth country, Guyana, formerly British Guyana. One of my father-in-law, well, he's dead now, but my father-in-law was from Mauritius. We were born, my wife and I were both born in Britain. So, the Commonwealth is very important to us. I do think, though, that as British people, we have to be a bit careful of having this idealistic vision of the Commonwealth, because we have to remember in some countries, they still have maybe not such a positive memory of Britain's colonial days. Now, it's mixed. Some people say to me when I go to some countries, it was better when the British were here. We can't even run our own country. Others will say, you have to remember what you did to our country. So I think Britain should be a little sort of tentative and perhaps not be seen to be the leader. It shouldn't be seen as the British Commonwealth, as it was the British Empire, then the British Commonwealth, then the Commonwealth. And I think that's quite good. And I think this is where there could be a really important role for India if it wanted to step up. here is a big country, a country of the future, lots of lots of potential there, lots of very smart people, looking for a role. And it's one of the very few fora in which neither superpower, I mean, I'm talking about the former Soviet Union, Russia, or China, or the United States are members of. And so I think it could play a really good, powerful role if it stepped up and used the Commonwealth in a positive way. And it could push for trade links, but just other types of links and mutual understanding. I think the Commonwealth could play a really powerful role. I think the British have to just be a little bit careful that we are not being seen to portray it as a new version of the empire or the old British Commonwealth. It should be very much equal partners. And we should understand not every country will have a positive view of British history in that country.
One of our viewers is interested in this question of the integrated defense review that came out a few weeks ago. And obviously neither of us is a sort of hard-powered defense expert, but it does raise this question of the match between global ambitions and the resources. The UK today is not the sort of Britain of the 19th century. So how do you see Britain's global role in area of sort of defense and military cooperation evolve post Brexit? Will Royal Navy patrol South China Sea, enforce freedom of navigation there, or is there a sort of more sort of limited role for the UK to play that is looming? What's your take on that?
I mean, one of the things that always surprises me is when you talk to defense secretaries in the UK, is how many countries. I think the last time we had British soldiers in 40 different countries in the world. I mean, we don't see most of this on the news, but quite often we're playing sometimes a background role or a support role or a training role. And I think that there's that soft power of the UK to remember. One of the things that did intrigue me about the defense review, the strategic defense review, we said we were going to get a sort of shiny new White House situation room. I genuinely don't know how good that is for us or not, or are we just trying to play, sort politics, or is there something positive about it? We've clearly identified cyber security as a big issue that needs tackling, including against the Chinese and the Russians. But at the same time, we're going to increase our number of warheads, and I'm not quite sure why a country of our size finds it necessary to increase the number of warheads that we have. I'm not quite sure of the case of that personally. The trade-off, the economics of it. We've already got warheads. Why do we need another 100? Given that the devastating effect of these and also their role as deterrents. But I think one of the things that we do hold strongly, and one of our points of friction when we were in the EU was NATO. We see NATO as incredibly important. We see it as keeping the peace in Europe. Some people would argue the EU kept the peace in Europe, and that was one of the points of discussion or differences that the UK quite often had. We think it's a really important alliance. And also, we are starting to talk more bilaterally with some of the individual EU countries. So, I mean, I have friends in Latvia. In fact, it's one of my hobbies is I play in a band with some Latvians, a rock band. And one of them is a politician in Latvia. And he said to me, they really value the British history in that region, but also the fact that we are starting to have bilateral relations with Poland and some countries. France itself, interestingly enough, people forget that France values the British military partnership, even though we might disagree on lots of things vis-a-vis the EU. And the British and the French are talking about security cooperation, quite apart from the EU. So I think it will be a lot of alliances. It might be a lot of training, but there'll also be forces being sent. But if you look at some of the UN operations over the last few years, what you find is it's become more regionalized. You're starting to see UN forces made up of people from the very same region. So a lot of UN operations in Africa, for example, are under the auspices of the African Union. Therefore, the UK doesn't have to be all around the world. We could just see where we can fit in. And I think this is one of the issues of global Britain. I don't think we are pretending we're a global superpower. And I think we are quite high up in some of our on some of our rankings. But we know we're not, we're not the Britain of the 19th century, but we are finding that role about punching above our weight, and very much through alliances.
That's great. I mean, this whole talk about Europe's strategic autonomy and the idea of the EU becoming a military power in its own right always struck me a little off. Although I do believe that continental Europe needs to step up, but the sort of idea that European governments will sort of surrender control over hard power to common European institutions always struck me as a little far-fetched, and I think the way forward really is in sort of cooperation between countries. And you're absolutely right about France. In the midst of the Brexit negotiations, bitter as they were, the military cooperation I think has been as good as ever. In sort of 2017.
There's two things I'd say about that. I know we're running out of time. One is that some people from smaller countries would tell me that they value, a European dimension to the army. Some of my Belgian colleagues, my Dutch colleagues, for example, would say to me quite often in the European Parliament, you've got to understand we're small countries. We would value more of a European dimension. Interesting enough, I remember talking to a Swedish colleague of mine who was very similar to me on the economics, and said to me, look, we might be quite aligned on economics, but look who our neighbour is. We like the idea of a common foreign and security defence policy at the EU level. My concern about that was quite often it was the very same people meeting in NATO, and then you go down the road and they would meet under the European auspices with the Americans and the Canadians as observers. And I thought, and one of my colleagues who was a former military guy said to me, it's just duplication. I don't mind if it complements what NATO is doing, but the EU shouldn't be trying to duplicate NATO. It's a waste of resources. And if we can find that, if the EU can, those countries that want to get together and combine forces, that's fine. I don't think, as a Brit, and particularly since we've left, I should be particularly critical of that. But it's a one size fits all that duplicates NATO. That's the concern.
I know we are running out of time, but before you go, I was hoping to ask you about something completely different, which is, I think when we first met, what brought us together was our mutual interest in political and economic reforms that were taking place at the time in the Arab world. You are a practicing Muslim, somebody who is very much interested in the interplay between religion and politics and classical liberal values. I mean, in retrospect, Arab Spring, which got me very excited about sort of the prospects of the region, seems at best as a missed opportunity. I wonder what your take on those.
Yeah, I'm equally disappointed by this. I see no inherent contradiction between being a classical liberal and a Muslim. Islam is very much a religion of the individual and their relationship with God. There's no real hierarchy between this. Allah is just the Arabic word for God. My Christian Arab teacher, my Arabic language teacher is a Lebanese Christian. He tells me that they also use the word Allah because that's just simply the Arabic word. And so there's no real difference. It's very, and in fact, I don't know if you've ever met Imad Ahmed from the Minaret of Freedom Foundation. He says that individualist angle towards Islam, that is what makes him a libertarian. Now, if only that were true. I'm not sure that's the case. I just happen to have both these beliefs. I've been disappointed twice. When Erdogan came to power and then had all those reforms and made Turkey a bit of an economic success case, I thought this might be a great model for the rest of the Muslim world to follow. Now we've seen Erdogan can't give up power, quite autocratic. I've been incredibly disappointed by that. Similarly with the Arab Spring, I was full of hope. But I think we also have to be quite clear about our Western hypocrisy. When the Sisi had the coup, we didn't condemn the coup. We thought, we kind of claimed it was democratic. Yes, we didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood, and we weren't, in favour of their policies. But I would have rather that they were removed at the ballot box rather than removed by a coup. And maybe it was a risk. Maybe I was being naive. But I think that once they were in power and had the responsibility of power, they were failing clearly, and I think they could well have been removed. And I know they were trying to change the constitution to keep them in power. But I think it's rather hypocritical of us to talk about democracy and then to support many people who talked about democracy in the Middle East then supported Sisi's coup and almost pretended it was a democratic movement. And I think we've got to be consistent about democracy. We have a history in the West of being quite hypocritical about democracy in that region. I mean, for example, don't forget the Americans and the British together undermined the democratic government of Iran and Mossadegh in the 50s. And that's what, and people still have memories of that. And it doesn't help us when we preach democracy if we're also hypocritical about it.
I'm not sure if it's just hypocrisy or if it's also the sort of misguided idealism where there is this underlying assumption that whenever you have an effort at democratization and liberalization, that it needs to go with this sort of much thicker package of progressive causes and change for the better and greater toleration, etc., which might be desirable, but just might not be realistic. That if you democratize deeply religious country, you might end up with religious political parties, and it's not going to look like Southern California in 5 years.
And we should also be aware of the fact that democracy doesn't necessarily mean liberal democracy. And there can be authoritarian democracy, the majoritarian democracy that does not respect the rights of the minorities. And maybe that's what one of the criticism, maybe a legitimate criticism of where the Brotherhood were going. But I would rather that they were removed at the ballot box rather than by a coup.
I'm afraid we'll have to draw this to a close on this note. So, Syed, thank you so much.
Thank you
for taking the time to join us. I want to thank the audience for the thoughtful questions. Hope for those who are with us for the first time for this event, this is just the beginning of a long and warm relationship with AI. You can check our scholars' work and our future events on our website, ai.org, or on social media. I look forward to welcoming Syed and everybody else to our functions again, hopefully in person soon once we are all vaccinated. So thank you. And although it's only Thursday, have a great weekend, everybody.